Okay, we are in Daniel chapter 2, and in verse 24, Daniel has one of those phrases, therefore, and what's the therefore, therefore? What has just happened? Okay, they just got an answer to their question, and God has given them the answer that they had requested, which was what did the dream mean? Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and Daniel prayed that night, and the answer was given to them, or was given to Daniel rather. But the four young men prayed that night. And so now Daniel has the answer for the king, and in verse 24, that's what that therefore is there for. So Daniel goes into Arioch, and he says, don't destroy the wise men. Daniel has a certain amount of care for his fellow wise men. He don't want them destroyed. They may not be what they should be. They may not be completely honest. They may not have a real religion, and they may be pagan in their thinking, but he still doesn't want them destroyed. And that's the way we need to be as well. We need to have the good of all men in mind, right? And so he has the good of his fellow individuals in mind. He doesn't, he's not saying that what they teach is right, and we're going to see that wholeheartedly here in a minute, but he still has their good in mind. And so he goes to Arioch and says, don't destroy them, says, take me before the king, and I will show the answer to the king. So the next verse, Arioch takes Daniel before the king, and what does he say to the king? Poor Arioch. You almost feel sorry for him, don't you? He's trying to get himself just a little bit of recognition. And who knows why he was trying to do that. Maybe he felt that the king didn't respect him enough or whatever, but he was trying to get a little bit of recognition all by himself. So somehow or another, I feel for the guy a little bit. You know, he don't have anything to do with anything, but he's trying to get some recognition in there somehow. I have found.
Okay. It's good. Apparently, he had some faith in Daniel, because what if he had said that to the king and then Daniel had totally blown it?
Yeah, he is sticking his neck out. That is true. So maybe he's hoping against hope that it works out. But nonetheless,
maybe that was a necessary introduction, because the king had said, kill the wise men. And he may have said, why'd you bring me the wise men? I told you to kill these men. So maybe this was a necessary way of saying, here's why I brought this guy in.
Could possibly
I didn't
be.
disobey your order. I'm here to help you. So maybe it was just kind of a way to introduce Daniel without having questions asked. He already answered the question as to why he brought him.
It could possibly be as well. Okay. So verse 26. Notice that Arioch identifies who Daniel is, that he is one of the captives of Judah. So who the individual is and where he's come from and his position in the kingdom, it would indicate that perhaps the king has not really taken much notice of Daniel at this point in time. Even though we've had an introduction to the king in chapter 1, Daniel's still not well known at this point in time. Okay, so verse 26, Daniel, or the king speaks to Daniel And he calls him Belteshazzar because that is his what?
Pagan name.
That's his pagan name or his Babylonian name, right? He says, can you make known to me the dream and the interpretation thereof? And so Daniel in verse 27 answers the king. And does Daniel take any credit? No. He does not take any credit. The first thing he does is make certain that no light shines on himself. The first thing he says, no one here on earth, not myself, no one else, the astrologers, the soothsayers, all of these individuals, and notice the soothsayers, the first time that term is used. That's kind of a cutting, that may or may not be kind of a cutting statement, but it's still accurate. All right, so he says these magicians, these soothsayers, they cannot tell the king's secret. There's not a man on earth. Verse 28, but. Boy, these buts in Daniel are extremely important, aren't they? There is, notice the definite article, a God. Now, the term a God there, he is setting apart that there is one God compared to the pantheon of gods that Nebuchadnezzar worships. And all of these soothsayers, all of these Chaldeans, all of these individuals that stood before the king, well, all they worship, he says there is only one God. And that one God can answer your questions. Daniel shines no light upon himself whatsoever. But there is a God that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Now, I'm going to say this, and we're going to come back to it, because this is an extremely important phrase. The term latter days here is a different word than what we're going to see used in other places to mean later on. It's the only time this particular word is used in the book of Daniel. It is different in the Aramaic, it's different in the Greek Septuagint, and it's different in the Hebrew when it's translated into Hebrew than these other terms that we will see in these other verses, and I'll point them out when we come to it. Now, I'm not going to talk about what that particularly means at this point in time, because we're going to go into that in great detail here in just a few minutes. So kind of hang on to that, but underline it. This is an extremely important phrase. But hang on to it. I know that's going to be hard for you. Hang on to it. We're going to get right back to it. He says, there is a God, and he has made known to the king what shall be in the latter days. He says, thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. So Nebuchadnezzar had these dreams when he was on his bed. And he begins to tell the king what he was thinking. Now, doesn't that bother you a little bit when somebody can tell you what you're thinking? Doesn't that unnerve you a little bit? When you was a child, when your aunt or your uncle or your grandfather sat you down on your knee and he began to tell you a little bit, said, now you did this because of this and this happened. And it was like, were you watching me when I was doing that? Because they knew something about you. They had a kinship with you that maybe you didn't realize before, right? Well, this goes far deeper than that. Daniel knew something about Nebuchadnezzar that no man on earth could know. Don't you think that shook him up just a little bit? I always thought my mom had eyes in the back of her head. But this is different. This is not that. But I'm just telling you, if you think that shook you up a little bit, think how much this must have moved Nebuchadnezzar deep inside to know somebody knew exactly what he was thinking, okay? He says, as for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass? This is a different word from the latter days. This means what's going to come to pass. This is what's going to come after this point in time. That's what that terminology means. What's going to come to pass? What's going to happen after my period, after me, from this day forward? Okay. What shall come to pass hereafter? And he that, meaning God, and he that revealeth secrets maketh known unto thee what shall, again, come to pass. That same word.
I thought it was interesting there about the first part of that verse, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed. You know, a lot of times when you have dreams, I know I do anyways, you've thought of something that day or something that but here it insinuates that these thoughts were something he'd never seen anything like this before. It's not like there's an image on the wall or a statue or something. This was truly something that was in his mind that he'd never seen or whatever before. And I know, I'll be thinking about somebody or something during the day, and then I go to bed and I'll dream about them or something. But evidently this was not something like that. It was something totally different.
Okay. Yeah, he was thinking about something. He wanted to know what was going to come to pass.
It's also interesting that he says, there's a God in heaven that revealed the secrets and maketh known to the king. And then he says, verse 29, God revealeth secrets, maketh known to thee. So Daniel's saying, these secrets weren't given to me, they were given to you. I'm going to tell you what they were, I'm going to interpret them, but God was talking to you. And I think that's impressive. He's saying God was talking to you. And that must have been, chill bump city too.
Yeah.
That God was talking to you. And then another thing I think of too is, it reminds me of Philip and the eunuch. Because sometimes God talks to us and we may not understand it. The king didn't get it. So he had to get help getting understanding it. But just because we don't understand it doesn't mean that God's not telling us something. So I think if we apply that to us, we'd say, God revealed his word to us. And if we don't understand it, that's not an excuse. We need to get someone to teach it to us or explain it to us. But God's talking to us.
And he speaks to us through his word. That's
Right.
true. Just like he did to the eunuch.
Right.
Exactly. All right. Okay. Then he reiterates what he kind of alluded to earlier in verse 30. But as for me, talking about himself, Daniel's talking about himself, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living. Because I'm not wiser than any other man. That's not the reason why this secret is revealed to me. It's not that I figured it out myself. Okay? But for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. It was made known to you. Okay? I'm not the one that figured this out. It was made known to you. Okay? All right? Now he goes on in verse 31 to tell him exactly what he saw. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image, this great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible, or frightening. Remember, he woke up and he was scared. It disturbed his sleep. He couldn't go back to sleep. He was frightened by it. And I suggest to you, Nebuchadnezzar was not some milquetoast kind of an individual to allow just any kind of thing to upset him. This was a terrifying image that he saw. Okay? It says, this image image's head was of fine gold, his breast and arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of the iron and the clay, and broke them into pieces. Okay, so he sees this image that terrifies him. It's of these different types of metals, the most pure and most valuable metal at the top, and it got increasingly stronger, but as it went down, but of less worth as it went down. Okay? But it was still standing. Now, off someplace else, a stone is cut without hands. No hands is laying hands on, is cutting this stone out. But this stone rolls down, hits the image, and it turns into dust. Okay, as we read the next verse, and the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, the gold broken into pieces together. So it was all standing together at that time, and became like chaff on the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. So this stone that hit this image while it was still standing in one piece, then just turned into dust, just like chaff. They had raised mounds at those times, and they would throw the wheat up in the air, and the chaff would be blown away, and the wheat would fall down because it was heavier, right? And just like that, this image was blown away. And the only thing that was left now was this rock, which now became a mountain, and it filled the whole earth. It went everywhere. That'd be a hard thing to try to figure out what that meant, don't you think? Frightening. Yeah, it took something other than man to figure out what that meant. God put that in his mind. It was to tell him what was going to pass, what did I say? After Nebuchadnezzar, hereafter, from this point on. That's what Daniel said. That's how Daniel interpreted it.
It's no wonder Nebuchadnezzar couldn't sleep, woke up out of his sleep, that kind of an image.
Okay. So now he goes on in verse 36, and he says, this is the dream. He didn't ask the king if it was the dream. He says, this is the dream. You know it's the dream. He said, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. That's almost cocky. It almost sounds that way, right? But that's just pure confidence. When you know something is the truth, you just speak the truth. And to those who don't know the truth, it almost sounds cocky at times, right? But he's not being cocky. He's just confident. He knows the truth. That was the dream. And he's just stating the obvious. That was the dream. Nebuchadnezzar's not arguing with him. Don't you know his eyes are about that big? He knew the thoughts of his heart. Nebuchadnezzar hadn't revealed it to anybody.
He's probably just as much afraid now as he was when he saw the dream.
Maybe even more.
Totally.
You talk about, again, you're talking about cold chills going up and down your spine. Somebody just told you what you thought in your mind. And this was in great detail. This is not no accident. Were you thinking of a chair? No, it's not one of those things. Was the card yellow? No, it's not one of those things. This is details. Okay. Verse 37, thou, O king, he interprets this thing. He says, thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath given unto thee into thy hand. Thou hast made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. That is very appropriate when we talk about Nebuchadnezzar. Now, I need to jump over at some point and show you the little bit of history of the kingdom of Babylon. But nothing could be more appropriate than to talk about Nebuchadnezzar being equal to the kingdom of Babylon, because nothing could be more appropriate. Nebuchadnezzar took the kingdom of Babylon to its zenith. Nebuchadnezzar, his father, started the kingdom up, but Nebuchadnezzar built that kingdom up, and as soon as Nebuchadnezzar died, the kingdom fell flat. When you talk about Babylon, you talk about Nebuchadnezzar. Nobody else. He was the kingdom of Babylon. He did great things for it. He built canals. He built great gardens. He built great walls. He built a double wall. His father built one wall around Babylon. He built a second wall around Babylon. It was considered impregnable at that time. He did great things for the people. The captives, even though they were captive, were allowed to worship as they wanted to worship, as long as they accepted his rule and didn't rise up against him. And we'll talk about some of the other good things that happened during that captivity. But Nebuchadnezzar had a lot of good things going for him in that kingdom. He really did. He ruled with an iron fist, but he was a good ruler in a lot of ways. Nonetheless, when you talk about the kingdom of Babylon, you talk about Nebuchadnezzar. So the next thing that comes up here, after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee. Well, we will talk about the Persian Empire that came up after the kingdom of Babylon. And the Persian Empire had its strengths, but it didn't do the things for its people that Nebuchadnezzar did for his people. They never did. They had some strong points, but they had a whole lot of weaknesses too. But they had some good points, and we'll talk about them. And then a third kingdom of brass, which will bear rule over all the earth. Well, the Greek Empire, what can you say about them other than the fact that they spread over all the earth? And they spread their Greek culture all over all of the earth. So that's accurate, painfully accurate, okay? And a fourth kingdom which shall be strong as iron. Boy, does that fit the Roman Empire? That fits the Roman Empire. They were strong as iron as far as the way they took other empires, it assimilated them, took the best of them, and if you rose up against them, they crushed you. And crush is the right word. But, as we will see, he says, and as iron hath breaketh all these, it shall break in pieces and bruise. And then he goes on in verse 41, whereas thou sawest the feet and the toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, and there shall be in it the strength of iron, for as much as thou sawest that iron mixed with miry clay. Sorry about that. And the toes of the feet that are part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly divided. So what did he say would be partly strong and partly divided?
The kingdom.
How many kingdoms?
The fourth kingdom.
The kingdom. One kingdom. The kingdom being the fourth kingdom. That's important. And we'll talk about why that's so important here in just a minute. All right. Verse 44, we're getting down to the real point. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So what was the real point of all of this? Okay, the whole point of this image and everything about it is to show that God is going to establish his kingdom. That the kingdom of men are going to fall before it, right? The kingdoms of men are not going to stop God's kingdom, the kingdom that was cut out without hands. What's the idea of what without hands indicate?
Spiritual.
Spiritual, not of this world, something that God's going to do, right? Not man. The other things were man's doing. And he's already talked about these are other earthly kingdoms. But this other kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. It's a spiritual kingdom. It is not of this world. Okay?
I think too, when you add this with verse 37, Daniel's introducing him. He says, "You're a king of kings. You're the goal, but you're not the king of kings." And he says, "God gave you this kingdom, or allowed you to have it."
Correct.
Which, even though you're the head of gold, I think all this is getting to the point, not just the kingdom itself, but the king, and then of course, later he says God's in control of everything. But
and that's part of the strong. And we see that in the first verse that God gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Right? We see that as part of the very theme that runs through Daniel, that God is in control. He's in control of the kings. He's in control of the kingdoms. Men run around and we all do our things, and we worry, and we do all of our stuff, and it's not that we don't have a responsibility to do. It's just that ultimately God is in control, and he's going to work his plan around even evil men if he has to. So, we need to have that confidence. We need to keep that confidence.
he allows things to happen as long as it's within, as long as it is within his will. There's free will. Obviously, humans have free
Right.
will. And so, but when God chooses to intervene, obviously we see he doesn't do that miraculously today. He did this day. But today he intervenes providentially. That's another lesson. But he allows things to go on until it's not what he wants.
Yeah, and he didn't always intervene miraculously
Not always.
in this day.
Right.
In this particular instance, he is showing that he does a miraculous thing to show
Just saying
how
in
he
that
was
day-
going to do it.
In that day and time.
This is a time of God's special working.
Yeah.
That is correct. Okay. All right. So we go on from here. In verse 45, he says, the stone that was cut out of the mountain without hands, that breaketh in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God. Again, he emphasizes there is one God and he is great. And again, that's in contrast to the pantheon of gods that Nebuchadnezzar knows. And hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. And again, this is a different word than what we saw up above that talks about in the last days. And the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. So he is telling the king here, I've told you what the dream was, and then therefore you know of a certainty that I know what the interpretation was, and you can have confidence in that. That's again, that's the way miracles work. It's what you were talking about. That's the confidence again was in God. He took no credit. All the credit was in God, and he says that you can know of these things for a certainty because of this miracle that was performed in order to show these things. And then verse 46, Nebuchadnezzar falls on his face and commands that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. Now there's some individuals have problems with the idea of him worshiping Daniel. There's several different ways that we can look at that terminology there. It says, and worship Daniel. A Jew, any man of God, of course, would not allow or would not accept worship on his person, because Peter says, "I'm a man just like you," and we see that several times throughout the scriptures. Men cannot accept worship; it's not allowed. Worship only goes to God. Some of the commentators say that what he is doing is offering worship to God, because in verse 47, or to Daniel's God is what I'm trying to say, I'm sorry. Because in verse 47 he says, and the king said unto Daniel, of a truth, your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou could reveal this secret. So that's what some of them believe actually took place there.
I think too, when you think of what just happened, I think a normal response would be to fall on your face. And when you're on your knees, that's kind of a position of submission.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the worship isn't necessarily he was worshiping him in the sense of a god, but no doubt he was probably thanking him over and over and over again. You've let me know what this means. It was bothering me, and offering him adoration, maybe. Not, so it may not be necessarily worship as to a god as much as relief and thanks and adoration for doing this for me.
Well, that leads into what we were talking about earlier, that if I think any human being at this point, somebody tell you what you were thinking, and that's your stomach's going to be flipping over. I mean, this is not an easy thing to take. So I think, like I said before, Nebuchadnezzar is not some fool. He's not, and he's already said this. We've already seen at the beginning of the chapter. He's not a foolish individual to accept the lies of these individuals to begin with, and then to be as frightened as he was by the dream. All of this kind of comes to its head when he finally gets an answer to his questions. So,
but it's obvious too, based on what we've looked at and what you said, Daniel kept over and over giving the credit to God. So whatever this was, Daniel would not have accepted it had it been
correct.
Because he kept over and over saying, it's not me, it's God. So whatever it wasn't Daniel didn't accept something that wasn't
It would not be
right,
proper.
so.
Correct. All right, I'm over my time. I appreciate everyone's kind attention and participation.